Hi, and welcome back to Ways of Reading. This is our series of conversations from Columbia College here at Columbia University about the books we read in Literature Humanities, our flagship first-year literature seminar for undergraduate students. I'm Joseph Howley. I'm Associate Professor of Classics, and I'm the Paul Brook Faculty Program Chair of Literature Humanities. And I'm really happy to be joined today by Johannes Haubold, Professor of Classics at Princeton University. Now, many of these other conversations have revolved around one text from our reading list, but I asked Professor Haubold to join us because one of the exciting things that happens in our reading list is that we read different literary traditions from the ancient world together. And Professor Haubold has made a career out of doing just this. He's a scholar of Greek philology and ancient Greek literature and of ancient cuneiform cultures. Professor Haubold, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, which ancient tradition did you come to first as a student, as a scholar, and how did you end up turning toward the other one?
So yeah, I came to the ancient world relatively late. I sort of dabbled in music, did various things. So I started with Latin, then discovered Greek literature, and then just as I was finishing my PhD on Homer, I discovered Babylonian literature. And that was in 1997, a long time ago now. But 1997 was an important year for the kind of things that interest me, in the sense that two important books appeared. First of all, Martin West's East Face of Helicon, which drew attention to similarities, parallels between Greek and Near Eastern literatures, and sort of planted the question of what these really meant. And then at the same time, in the same year, a new edition of the Gilgamesh epic came out by Seymour Papola in the in the State Archives of Assyria series. Now that wasn't a great edition at the time, but that came a few years later. But it was serviceable. And so suddenly we had the epic in much better shape than it had ever been known before. Um, and yeah, I mean, I decided this, I needed to get interested in this as a Homerist. Um, I learned the language, Akkadian, and I started studying Gilgamesh and other cuneiform Akkadian texts, and never really looked back. This was for me a transformative event, not just in the sense that I discovered something I hadn't known before, but also, and perhaps especially, in that it enabled me to see what I already knew in a completely different light. So this transformed me, I think, as a student of Greek literature just as much as it sort of added to my horizons in looking at the ancient Mediterranean.
You mentioned this book, it's a very influential book, West's East Face of Helicon, which introduced a lot of us to the idea that the Greek texts we sometimes think of as being the oldest or even originary parts of the Greek tradition, like the Homeric epics, can be seen as having ancestry or sort of some sort of influence from Near Eastern culture. When we're reading different cultural traditions together, sometimes we find ourselves looking for these signs of influence, and sometimes we find kinds of comparison or points of contact even where we don't think there could be an influence or where we can't really prove one. I know that, in classical philology, some critics said at some times there's been a real concern with demonstrating the influence. Can you say a little bit about different ways we might identify or think about points of contact between different traditions? Does it always have to be determined by a clear genealogy of influence?
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, that's a really important question, in fact. Um, Influence has historically taken center stage, partly because we trace a genealogy of Western literature back to Homer. And so if we then discover older texts, and Gilgamesh and many other Babylonian texts are much older than the Homeric epics, that look rather similar, we naturally wonder whether we can extend this genealogy back into a more distant past. This has ideological implications. in the sense that, it might affect of how we think of European literature or Western literature as something separate, apart from a wider Near Eastern world. And so, yes, when the Epic of Gilgamesh was first discovered, and we should always remember this is not so long ago. I mean, this is a very ancient text in one sense, but it is also a very recent text, an interesting paradox. And so when this was first discovered, people were very struck with parallels, of course, with the Bible, with Hebrew scripture, but also with Homeric epic. And they focused for a long time, they focused on issues of influence. And that's fair enough. I think, that's a legitimate way of going about it. But of course, there are practical limitations to this. The Babylonian world is just over the horizon of the Greek one, and we cannot reliably trace lines of transmission from Babylon or Nineveh to Greece. That's just not possible with the evidence that we currently have. And then, of course, practical considerations aside, the issue of influence can also become a red herring. It can become a distraction in the sense that it sort of focuses attention on questions that would not have been of particular interest to ancient audiences, who would been much keener to investigate the big questions that these texts actually address. That is to say, the human condition, our place in the world, the meaning of a human life, especially in view of the fact that we must all die. I mean, it sort of, I don't want to be morbid about it, but these are important issues that affect us very directly, that affected ancient readers very directly. Those were the questions for which they read the texts. They were not, as it were, philologists and literary historians who wanted to figure out finally who copied from whom and how exactly that worked.
I think this is something our students might notice immediately when, having read Gilgamesh, it's impossible to escape how much of Gilgamesh's story, although it begins apparently about, a kind of a big, strong hero who kills monsters and goes on adventures, it makes a very prominent turn, maybe halfway through the epic, towards exactly the struggle you're talking about with the question of mortality. What does it mean for us that we must die? And what does that mean for how we should live? I think that will probably leap out at students when they then turn to the Iliad and they find Achilles struggling with the exact same question. I wonder, do you have other ideas of points of comparison or similarity that we might find or that we should keep an eye out for, or just examples that you think of that sort of illustrate what we get out of reading these two traditions together?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sometimes find it useful in class to start with very concrete examples, really rather specific examples, such as famous parallel between two line similes in the two epics. Similes that are used to describe the hero just at the moment when he stands at the dead body of his beloved friend. Gilgamesh in Tablet 8 of the Gilgamesh epic, Achilles in Book 18 of the Iliad. And what you find there at these structurally very similar points in these two narrative arcs are really strikingly similar images of the bereft lion.
I have these here. Let me just pull these up and we can look at them together. And you can see
Yeah,
I've
so
committed a classic classicist's faux pas. I've put the Homer first, even though Gilgamesh is, of course, much older.
well, you see, this is an interesting point. I mean, one of the first things I often say to students when we look at Mesopotamian literature, ancient Mesopotamian literature, and these unimaginably ancient texts, is that I say to them, I don't want to be facetious, but I think this is an important point to remember, that these texts were not born ancient. And in fact, that they are self-consciously belated. They are sophisticated. They look back to a long tradition of other similar texts whose resources they explore and exploit. So I think, switching around the order can be a useful thing to do. Anyway, we are not here primarily interested in the question of influence, in whether Homer or one of his predecessors encountered this particular simile in Gilgamesh and in some sense copied it. But really interested in exploring what these similes do in their respective contexts. So you see immediately, how similar they are. Some great bearded lion in Homer when some man has stolen his cups away from him. The lion comes back too late and is anguished. So this anguish over being of a loss, of a bereavement, turns into many valleys and so on. The movement, hence the back and forth, the restlessness that is plays it out. And you see that in Gilgamesh too. He veiled the face of his friend like a bride's, like an eagle. He circled around his corpse, a different simile first, and then like a lioness, feminine in the original, forced to abandon her cubs, he paced back and forth before and behind him. So it is, of course, these similes belong to a long tradition of line imagery in the ancient world, imagery that was typically used to project power, control. On the Lion Gate in Mycenae, for example, you see it in the palaces of the Assyrian kings in Nineveh and elsewhere. But here, this image is quite clearly subverted, right? So it comes to express not power and unfettered power and control, but it comes to express the exact opposite: bereavement, anguish, and so this is something these texts share. And then we might next ask, well, how do they develop this idea of the powerful, heroic individual being brought to his knees in this way? And we could start from these passages themselves. We could start from the fact that the lion in the Iliad is angry, taken with bitter anger, and anger is an affect which, of course, is thematic in the Iliad. It's the first word of the whole poem, and it is not very much to the fore in Gilgamesh. It's not very prominent in Gilgamesh. Why? Why is that? How does that fit with the larger affective economy of these two texts? So we could go on endlessly exploring this, but just to say that this kind of comparison gives us interesting starting points, interesting entry points into reading the text.
Yeah, it's one of the things that strikes me putting these two together, and I suppose in part here I'm under the influence of Eric Auerbach's classic comparative reading of Hebrew scripture and Homeric narrative, is the way that the Homeric narrator, as you say, makes very clear what Achilles is feeling. And Gilgamesh's narrator never names the emotion. We get this simile of the lioness forced to abandon her cubs, and it's kind of up to us to understand what feeling that is, or what state of mind, what affect that is, that the lioness is experiencing, that Gilgamesh is experiencing.
Wonderful. And yeah, I mean, it's very apt of you to mention Auerbach, of course, in this context, because we can then take this in a different direction and ask, what we can say about the poetics of these two texts, how they invite us to relate to the story as readers. And one obvious starting point would be to look at the opening sequences where the text, in a sense, introduces itself to us.
Yeah.
And suggests a sort of a readerly contract with us, right?
Let's turn there now. So I have here, here is the opening to Gilgamesh.
Yeah, yeah. So famous passage by now. Added to an older version of the text, which didn't have this at all, which just started with the line, "He was outstanding among kings," a very heroic introduction of the protagonist. Here, it's much more about going deep, insight that comes from suffering. And in a sense, we are taken on a journey as readers. We are invited to follow this man, this suffering, insightful man, down into the foundations of society, of the city. And there we find the text. There we find the epic, right? So we climb up to the wall of Uruk in 18. We walk around, we survey the city, we survey the foundation. And in the foundation, we look for the cedarwood box, 24. We undo as almost like a foundation document. These were traditionally used in Mesopotamia. They were actually deposited in the walls of the city. And we take out the box, we open its clasps, we take out the tablet of lapis lazuli, wonderful little detail. Lapis lazuli, of course, being the material that Gilgamesh discovers when he travels to the edges of the world and comes to the Garden of the Sun. He discovers that it grows on trees, literally. And read aloud, read of all that Gilgamesh went through, read of all his suffering. So this text addresses us very directly as its readers. It takes us by the hand. It invites us to go on this journey. And the contrast with Homer could, in many ways, not be starker.
Yeah. Yeah, let's turn from this to the Iliad, the proem to the Iliad. Much shorter.
Much shorter. And also, interestingly, directed.
Yeah.
Directed not at us. We are not the addressee of sin. We are not going to walk up city walls, inspect the brickwork, discover the text, and read. No. So this text talks to the muse, the goddess, who needs to, in a sort of epiphanic leap, bring this text before our eyes. We can do nothing, says the poet in a famous passage, which I'm sure you also read in Iliad 2, just before the catalogue of ships. We know nothing, he says. You muses know everything, and are present. This idea of a presence, of making the song present, is crucial for Homer. So then you can link that up with what people have said about the cinematic qualities of Homeric epic, the vivid nature of Homeric narrative, the way in which it comes before us, as opposed to the very different approach that Gilgamesh encourages us to take. I've been talking about differences between texts. The differences can be just as telling as the similarities.
I think I'm going to put the text away here. That's a really helpful tool for us to think about because, as we've said, there are going to be moments where these texts being the products of very similar ancient worlds, we will naturally find similar presences, like the lion, this incredibly fierce creature that would have been known to anyone living in the ancient Near East or the ancient Mediterranean. Although, as I'm fond of telling my students, by the time of the Roman Empire, there were no more lions in the Western Mediterranean or even in Greece. And uh, the Greeks and the Romans knew this, but they didn't quite know why, which is something I often find a little bit poignant. They didn't know why this animal had gone away. But we will so it's sort of not surprising to find some images being constant, nor is it surprising to find constant parts of the human experience being engaged with in these particular ways. But we're also talking here, when we think about the beginnings of these epics, we're talking about things that are kind of essential to the project of writing poetry. Much of the literature that we read, especially the ancient literature, actually takes some pains to tell us where it has come from. So we read Enheduanna's exaltation of Inanna, and there's a point towards the end where the speaker, Enheduanna, says, here's how I created this, and here's what I'm doing it, bringing it into the world. And the narrative of Gilgamesh says, here's where you can go find this text. It lives in the world. And that makes it all the more striking to me, the way that the Homeric narrator really doesn't claim that this story exists in the world. The narrator reminds us that he or she is singing it, and every time it's sung, it's somehow sung again, which um, you know, I can't help but then think about the long scholarly debates and conversations in our field about where exactly epic comes from and what the relationship is between oral transmission and written transmission. And so it's just that's sort of my own particular research interests, but it's so striking to see these moments in the text illuminated um, not only by kind of our modes of reading, but it's as if by putting one text next to the other text you put next to it is suddenly a different source of light, and it casts different shadows, and you read it in different ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. By reading comparatively, we recontextualize, and by recontextualizing, we see different things. And this is immensely exciting to me personally. And it's been a lot, very much a driver behind this kind of research. And you can take this in all sorts of different directions. You can think about leadership in these two texts, which is such an important theme in both. The question of what happens as the big powerful protagonists do their thing and suffer their
Mhm.
fate. What happens to everyone around them? This is
Mhm.
this is a huge concern in both poems from early on. Um, in fact, you might say it's in many ways the scandal that gets the Epic of Gilgamesh going in the first place.
Mhm.
Gilgamesh is lording it over his own city. He is the shepherd of the people, the poet says expressly. He is the shepherd of the people, and yet he
Right.
behaves like a bull trampling through society. He keeps young men from uh, being with their women. He disrupts family life. He claims the right of the first night, and all these things. And so then you can take this back to the Iliad, and you can see how Agamemnon, the shepherd of the people, thinks of many different things, but not very much at the welfare of his own people, until it is sort of painfully driven home to him that
Yeah.
he had better. And so again, we can play this wonderful game of tracing difference and similarity. We can see how these story arcs that in many ways look so similar um, tackle this problem of the uncaring shepherd or the distracted shepherd
Mhm.
of the people differently. In Gilgamesh, you very quickly come up against the problem of counsel,
Right.
milku. This is really a central concept in all Babylonian thought and all the major Babylonian texts, certainly in Umayr Elish and Gilgamesh address it in great depth. How can we ensure the flow of communication, of information in a society that is and has to be, according to Babylonian political theorizing, has to be hierarchical. History begins in Babylon when kingship descends from heaven. And it is basically the history of kingship. So when we are thinking politically in Babylon, we are always thinking about kings, about autocratic leaders. But we are not therefore being naive about, what all the things that could go wrong if you think along those lines. And in Gilgamesh, what we see increasingly as we go through the text is this emphasis on building structures of counseling and educating the king to adhere to them. And of course, the wonderful closing speech of Gilgamesh, when he comes back to Uruk after all his travels, and he explains to Urshanabi, who is with him at this point, he introduces his city, and he explains that the 7 counselors have laid its foundations. And you see him there right at the end of it all, after he has taken extended advice from Uttanapishti, his ancestor. You see him embracing the idea of a society that is built not on brute force, not on the fact that he happens to be 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, who can do whatever he wants. No, on counsel.
Right. This observation you just shared casts for me so many lights forward through our fall reading list. So I'm thinking of the way Aeschylus's Oresteia stages in part how we get from the ancient world of ruthless kings into a modern world of democracy that nonetheless is not quite perfect and not quite dependable. I'm thinking also of this image that we often dwell on in the Gospel of John, where Jesus talks about being the shepherd and the sheepfold, and there's this the use of simile and metaphor is suddenly so much more complicated and forceful for making claims about divinity, and yet is drawing on exactly the same language and imagery that we see of Agamemnon and of Gilgamesh. And I'm thinking in particular of the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid, which is often so challenging to first-time readers because it seems to be such a enthusiastic, optimistic, kind of patriotic narrative. And yet, if you pay attention, for example, to kind of the people around its hero and how they suffer for his quest, you see that Aeneas leaves all these bodies in his wake as he's trying to fulfill this divine mission. And indeed, he can never really take advice. He just sort of does what he's told and stumbles along. And so what you get is actually, I think, that's such a so much later epic, but really, I think reading these earlier epics and coming at it from different traditions equips us to pay attention to some of the most important things in the text. I have a final question for you in our closing minutes, which you talked about the sort of the way you had come to the study of ancient languages and antiquity, and I'm wondering if you just have a kind of a sort of a big picture reflection or observation on how the moves you've made to the choices you've made to read in different traditions, to go and learn a new language and a new writing system and seek out new connections. How has that changed how you think about the texts and traditions that you started reading with? You've published commentaries on Homer. You have been a Homerist, and now you are something more than that. But I wonder now, when you go back when you teach Homer with students, or when you think about the Greek tradition, how have your encounters with the Akkadian, the Babylonian worlds changed how you think about Greek literature?
Well, I would say that it has in many ways freed me to, go try different paths. That in very concrete terms, this can be useful when it comes to, for example, thinking about Herodotus and what he says about Persia and about the Greeks, and suddenly if you read on the Babylonian side, or the Babylonian documents that cast light on Persian thinking, you see how how he is part of a much larger conversation and how he inflects that. So yes, you talked, Joe, earlier about, you know, the light, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
different light sources, and the ways that the shadows fall differently. That has been really crucial to me. This idea that we are not simply burdened with a tradition which, yes, we want to preserve and we want to um, honor. And I'm very serious about that. Yes, indeed, I am a commentator of you know, classic texts like Homer, and I think this is important. But at the same time, we can get trapped in this in this notion of, you know, being the heirs of something that is monolithic and burdensome, and you know, potentially also politically nefarious. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we have to ask ourselves, why draw the line at the Hellespont? Why not go beyond? You know, is there not life? Is there not desire? Is there not pathos on the other side? Of course, yes, there is. Yes, there is, and it is so liberating. You know, just as it is liberating if you know, if you live in your town and you just take a different turn at some point, and you make contact with your neighbors on, you know, on this side rather than that, and just living a sort of a more fully embedded
Mm-hmm.
life. Um, that I mean, in this case, we're talking about um, texts that are very, very ancient. We're talking about the ancient world, but you know, I think these things do still matter to us. So the idea that we can move beyond, across boundaries, we can move backwards and forwards. We can also come back to the Greeks. You know, we are not simply shackled into this. We can go out, we can come back, we can move laterally, and so on. And of course, the Babylonian tradition, as so many of these Near Eastern ones, is a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
New tablets are getting discovered all the time, and this again encourages us to see, you know, to reconstruct the Greek tradition too in our minds as a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. I think 3 years ago, when we first added Mesopotamian literature to our syllabus, we nevertheless persisted in beginning the year by reading the Iliad. And students pointed out at the time that this was, not chronological. We could talk about whether chronology is important to us. But I remember a student pointing out to me very persuasively that it seemed like we were trying to have our cake and eat it too, that we were trying to read beyond the Greek tradition and yet couldn't bring ourselves to unseat Homer from his pillar. And I'm really pleased that we are now, trying that, doing it differently. And, sometimes I think particularly in an era of, dwindling enrollments in humanities courses and dwindling funding for humanistic study. And, you have pundits and politicians talking like studying literature or ideas doesn't really matter. When we feel like our resources or our status is scarce or under threat, it's easy for us to think that our curricula or our reading lists are somehow zero sum. That if we read more, say, into the cuneiform tradition, that will necessarily detract from our study of the Greek tradition. But one of the things I've found in working on this syllabus and working with the instructors and talking to people like you is that when we can make affirmative choice to say, read Gilgamesh before we read the Iliad, that is not only an opportunity to engage deeply with a transformative piece of literature, Gilgamesh, it's also a way of investing in our reading of Greek literature. So it's something I'm really
I
excited
couldn't
about.
I couldn't agree more, Bill. That sounds absolutely right to me. Yeah.
Professor Haubold,
There's no need to be afraid. There's no need to be defensive.
yeah,
These are all resources, and they will all, at the end of the day, um, be, you know, enabling, um, yeah.
I'm very excited to see as the year goes forward what our students make of this. And I'm really grateful to you for taking some time to talk to us and help us think about how we might get into this. Professor Johannes Haubold is a professor of classics at Princeton University, the author of many books, most recently the co-editor with, among others, Sophus Hella, who's the translator of our Gilgamesh and our Enheduanna in this class, of a book called Enuma Elish, the Babylonian Epic of Creation, which was a text that we read briefly in this class. Not on our reading list right now, but something I really recommend to students who become interested in this, not least because it builds an amazing bridge between, it can't help build an amazing bridge between the Babylonian literature we're talking about and the world that ancient Hebrew scripture comes from as well. So much to be done with the Enuma Elish. Very excited about this new book. And I'm so grateful to you for taking some time to talk to Professor Haubold. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.